Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The air in the great hall of Valheim was thick with the sense of roasted meat, spiced wine, and the cloying perfume of ambition. 100 conversations wove a tapestry of sound, punctuated by laughter as sharp and cold as the winter wind rattling the high, arched windows. To Serene, it smelled of decay. It sounded like a funeral. She was a ghost returning to her own wake, and the cold that seeped into her bones had nothing to do with the draft snaking across the flagstones. Her hand tightened around her son's, his small fingers a fragile anchor in a sea of memory and fear. 5 winters had passed since she last stood here, but the hall remembered her shame, the stone itself seeming to recoil from her presence. The whispers began as a ripple, a hiss of silk, and suspicion that spread from the outer tables inward. Eyes, once filled with deference, now held a glint of predatory curiosity. They slid from her worn leather tunic and mended cloak to the boy at her side, his silver eyes wide as he took in the grandeur and the menace of the room. He was the reason she had returned. He was the secret she had carried into exile, a truth more damning and more sacred than any vow. As the ripple of whispers reached the dais, the laughter died. The music faltered. A heavy, suffocating silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the great hearth. They saw her now, not just a shadow at the door, but Seren Halvar, the Baron Luna, the Alpha King's great failure, returned from the unforgiving wilds. Her face was leaner, etched with the hardship of a life lived on the fringes, but her spine was straight. The shame they had branded her with had been forged into a shield. She felt the weight of their judgment, the memory of their sneers when the healers had pronounced her empty, a vessel incapable of carrying the royal line. They had watched as the king, his face a mask of iron, had stripped her of her title and sent her away, a wolf without a pack, a queen without a kingdom. Now that ghost stood before them, and beside her was a child who wore the king's face. Liam pressed closer to her leg, his scent a mix of pine needles and innocent fear. He did not understand the venom in their stares, but he felt the shift in the air, the primal tension of a pack turning on an intruder. Seren brushed a thumb over his knuckles, a silent promise of protection she wasn't sure she could keep. Her gaze swept the hall, meeting the hostile stares of the court nobles, the she-wolves who had vied for her place, the elders who had condemned her. She saw Lady Alara, her former handmaiden, now seated near the empty Luna's throne, her gown the color of blood, a triumphant smirk twisting her lips. It was Alara who had first planted the seeds of doubt, whispering of curses and bad blood. But Seren's attention was not for them. Her eyes were fixed on the high throne at the center of the dais, a monstrous thing of carved obsidian and silver. It was empty, the king was not there. The thought brought both a tremor of relief and a sharp pang of dread. His absence was a temporary reprieve, a silence before the storm. The court was his instrument, and it was already playing a prelude to her destruction. "It cannot be," a voice, loud and incredulous, shattered the silence. It was Lord Boren, a corpulent elder with a beard stained yellow from wine. He heaved himself to his feet, his chair scraping against the stone. "The exiled one, here!" His words broke the dam. The whispers erupted into a torrent of accusations. "Look at the boy!" The king's eyes. "By the moon? It's uncanny." "A trick, a witch's glamour to seize the throne." "She was barren," the elders proclaimed it. Seren stood her ground, her body a fortress around her son. She had known this would happen. She had spent 5 years rehearsing this moment in her mind, imagining every insult, every challenge, but the reality of it was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Her wolf, a creature she had thought long dead and buried beneath layers of grief and solitude, stirred within her. It was a faint, pathetic thing, starved and weak from years of suppression, but it lifted its head and tasted the hostility in the air. It wanted to snarl, to show its teeth, but it had no strength. It had been broken the day its alpha had turned his back on it. Then a new scent cut through the hall, silencing the chaos more effectively than any command. It was the smell of a winter storm rolling down a mountain, of cold iron and pine sap, of absolute, undisputed power. Ozone crackled in the air. The nobles scrambled back to their seats, heads bowed, their aggression dissolving into sycophantic fear. The great oaken doors behind the dais swung open without a sound, and he entered. King Alarion Velric. He was as she remembered, yet more so. The 5 years had carved new lines of ruthless authority into his face. The silver streaks at his temples were more pronounced, stark against the black of his hair. He wore no crown, no ostentatious finery, only a simple black tunic and breeches that did nothing to hide the lethal power coiled in his frame. A fresh scar, a pale white line, cut down from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder that even kings were not immune to violence. His silver eyes, the very same shade as the sun she hid behind her, were chips of ice. They swept the hall once, a silent, imperious demand for order, and the room fell into a deathly quiet. He had not seen her yet. He moved toward the throne, his presence a physical weight that pressed down on every soul in the hall. Seren's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching silence. Her wolf whimpered, a low, mournful sound only she could hear, torn between the instinct to submit and the maternal fury to protect her pup. Alarion paused, his hand resting on the arm of his throne. His gaze narrowed, sensing the discord, the scent of a stranger in his domain. His head turned slowly, deliberately, his eyes scanning the crowd. Then they found her. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The fire in the hearth ceased to crackle. The wind died outside the walls, and the breath caught in 100 throats. The king's infamous control, the iron mask he wore for his court, fractured. Seren saw it in the minute flaring of his nostrils as he caught her scent. Pine, wild herbs, and the lingering trace of a bond he had tried to sever. She saw it in the way his knuckles turned white where he gripped the throne. His silver eyes, cold in distant moments before, ignited with a raw primal fire. They locked onto hers, and in their depths, she saw 5 years of fury, betrayal, and a pain so deep it mirrored her own. His gaze dropped, snagging on the small figure at her side. He saw Liam. He saw the silver eyes staring back at him, the stubborn set of the jaw, the untamed black hair. He saw himself, reflected in the face of a child who should not exist. The blood drained from his face, leaving the scar on his temple a livid slash against his pale skin. The air around him grew impossibly cold, thick with a power that promised annihilation. Seren felt a tremor run through him, a shockwave that traveled across the space between them and struck her in the chest. His wolf was awake, roaring with a confusion and rage that vibrated through the floor. It recognized her. It recognized the pup. It was a maelstrom of conflicting instincts: mate, heir, traitor, threat. Alarion, she breathed, the name a ghost on her lips, unspoken for half a decade. She had not meant to say it, but the sight of him, the raw shock on his face, had torn it from her. He took a step down from the dais, and another. He moved with the predatory grace of a great wolf stalking its prey, his eyes never leaving her, never leaving their son. The court held its breath, a collective statue of fear and anticipation. Every step he took echoed like a drumbeat, counting down the final seconds of her life, or the beginning of a war. He stopped 10 feet from her, close enough that she could smell the rage rolling off him in waves, but also something else, something buried so deep it was almost undetectable. The ghost of their bond, the scent of the man she had once loved. He did not speak to her, he did not even seem to see her anymore. His entire being was focused on Liam. He crouched down, not in a gesture of kindness, but like a predator assessing a new element in its territory. His power washed over the boy, a crushing weight of pure alpha dominance. Liam, who had never known a world beyond the quiet solitude of the forest, flinched but did not cower. He lifted his small chin, his silver eyes meeting the king's without fear. A low rumbling growl, impossibly deep for a child, vibrated in his small chest. It was instinct. It was blood calling to blood. A flicker of something, Astonishment, perhaps even pride, passed through Alarion's eyes before being extinguished by cold fury. He reached out a hand, not toward the boy, but toward the collar of his tunic. With a flick of his wrist, he pushed the fabric aside, exposing the pale skin of Liam's shoulder. There, stark against his flesh, was the mark. A crescent moon, etched in silver as if kissed by the goddess herself. It was the ancient sigil of the Velric line, the birthmark of the prophesied heir. A collective gasp went through the hall. It was true, all of it. Alarion's hand trembled slightly as he let the fabric fall back into place. He rose to his full, intimidating height, his shadow swallowing both Serenen and the child. He finally turned the full force of his glacial fury upon her. The mask was back in place, harder and more impenetrable than ever. His voice, when he spoke, was not a roar of rage, but a low, deadly whisper that cut deeper than any blade, a sound meant only for her. "What?" he growled, the word vibrating with a threat that promised a world of pain. "Have you done?" "I kept him safe," Seren answered, her voice rough from disuse but steady. It was the only truth that mattered, the shield she held against the inferno in his eyes. "From you." From them, her chin lifted, a gesture of defiance toward the sea of hostile faces in the hall. From the whispers that would have named him a curse or a bastard, and from the alpha who would have had to choose between his pride and his son. The words struck him. She saw the impact in the tightening of his jaw, the muscle that jumped beneath his scar. For a moment, the fury in his eyes was eclipsed by the ghost of a remembered pain, the agony of a king who believed his line was ending. He had mourned the children they never had, but his grief had been a cold, silent thing, locked away behind the iron walls of his duty. Her grief had been her exile. Alarion's control snapped back into place like a steel trap. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible flick of his fingers. Two of his personal guard, the massive warriors known as the Stone Wolves, materialized from the shadows near the dais. They moved with a silent, fluid deadliness that spoke of years of battle. Their faces were impassive, but their eyes held a grim understanding as they looked upon her and the child. "Take them to the West Wing," Alarion commanded, his voice once more the flat, cold tone of a king giving an order. He did not say her chambers. He did not have to. Everyone knew the West Wing housed the Luna suites. The implication was a slap in the face to the entire court, a declaration and a warning. No one is to enter, no one is to leave. Post a full guard. He turned his back on her then. A deliberate, brutal dismissal. He ascended the dais and took his seat on the obsidian throne, his silver eyes sweeping over his stunned court. "The feast," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "is over." The Stone Wolves flanked her. One, a gray-bearded warrior whose scent was of old leather and steel, gave a slight, almost respectful dip of his head. The other remained rigid, his gaze fixed forward. Seren placed a hand on Liam's shoulder, a silent command for him to walk. She did not look back as the hall erupted into a panicked frenzy of speculation behind them. She did not need to see the triumphant sneer on Lady Alara's face or the confused fear in the eyes of her one-time allies. All that mattered was the unyielding stone beneath her feet and the warmth of her son beside her. They were led from the noise and the light, down corridors that echoed with her own history. The tapestries on the walls depicted the victories of the Velric kings. She remembered weaving a small repair into the corner of one, a scene of Alarion's first battle, her fingers tracing the silver thread of his wolf form. Now her fingertips brushed against the cold wall as she passed, a stranger in her own home. The scent of the castle was almost overwhelming. It was the smell of power, of old magic soaked into the very mortar, of beeswax and herbs, and under it all, the pervasive, dominant scent of its alpha. It was everywhere, a constant pressure against her senses, a reminder that this was his territory, and she was here only by his decree. Liam walked beside her, his small hand gripping hers tightly. He did not speak, his eyes taking in the towering arches and the suits of armor that stood like silent sentinels in the torchlight. He had grown up with the sky for a roof and the forest floor for a carpet. This place of stone and shadow was a different kind of wilderness, and he navigated it with the same cautious watchfulness. The guards stopped before a set of carved redwood doors. The West Wing. A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty hall settled deep in Seren's bones. The gray-bearded guard pushed the doors open, and the scent of her own past rushed out to meet her. Faint traces of dried lavender and rose. The ghost of a perfume she had stopped wearing 5 years ago mingled with the thick, stale smell of disuse and dust. The Luna's chambers, they were just as she had left them. A silver shawl was still draped over a high-backed chair, as if she had just shrugged it off. A book of old legends lay open on a small table by the window, its pages coated in a fine layer of gray dust. The vast bed, with its furs and velvet canopy, was a monument to a life that was no longer hers. This was not an act of kindness. It was a calculated cruelty, a way to imprison her not just within walls, but within her own memories. The guards retreated, their heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. The doors clicked shut with a sound of finality, followed by the heavy thud of a bar being dropped into place. They were locked in. "Mama," Liam's voice was small in the cavernous room. "Is this the bad place?" Seren knelt, turning him to face her. She brushed a stray lock of black hair from his forehead, her heart aching at the worry in his silver eyes. "No, little wolf, it's just a place with a lot of ghosts." She forced a smile. "We are safe here. I will not let anyone harm you." He seemed to accept that, his trust in her absolute. He began to explore the room with a child's boundless curiosity, his small hands tracing the patterns on a dusty tapestry, his nose twitching at the strange new scents. Seren watched him, a fierce, protective love swelling in her chest. She had done this for him. She would do it all again. She had raised him in the wild, taught him the ways of the forest, kept him hidden from a world that would have torn him apart, and in doing so, she had kept a part of herself alive. An hour passed, or perhaps it was 3. Time had become fluid, stretching and compressing in the suffocating silence. She had settled Liam on a pile of furs near the hearth, where he had finally succumbed to exhaustion and drifted to sleep, his breathing soft and even. Seren sat in the silver-draped chair, her hands clenched in her lap, waiting. She knew he would come. This was far from over. The bar on the door was lifted with a grating scrape. The doors opened and closed, and he was there, filling the space with his sheer presence. He did not speak, simply stood in the shadows by the entrance, his silver eyes tracking her every move. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. He had shed his formal tunic and now wore a simple shirt of gray linen, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the corded muscle and the network of faint silvery scars that mapped his skin. He looked less like a king and more like the warrior he was. "You always did like to sit by the fire," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was a simple observation, devoid of warmth, but it carried the weight of 1,000 shared nights. "Some things do not change," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. He moved into the room, circling her like a predator. He stopped by the table with her book, his long fingers tracing its dusty cover. "You left this behind." "I left everything behind." His head snapped up, his eyes flashing. "You did not. You stole my son. You stole the future of this kingdom and hid him in the dirt like a common secret." "I saved my son," she corrected, rising to her feet to face him. They were of a height, something that had always been a point of quiet connection between them. Now it only served to heighten the confrontation. "Had I brought a newborn babe to you then? A child born from a womb your healers declared barren? What would you have done, Ilarion? In your grief, in your rage at my failure, you would have listened to your counsel. They would have called him an omen, a bastard, a product of witchcraft. They would have demanded his death to cleanse the line. And you," she took a step closer, her own anger, long dormant, finally stirring. "You would have let them." A muscle feathered in his cheek. "You presume to know my mind." "I knew your heart," she whispered, and the words hung between them, a painful, undeniable truth. "The man I knew died the day he exiled his mate." The blow landed. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. He took a step back, putting space between them, as if her proximity burned him. His gaze fell upon the sleeping form of Liam by the fire. He stared at the boy for a long time, his expression unreadable. The rage, the cold fury, seemed to drain out of him, replaced by something heavier, the weight of a crown, of a kingdom, of a bloodline he thought had ended. "Why now?" he finally asked, his voice raw. "After 5 years of silence, why return and throw him to the wolves you claim to fear?" Seren's own anger subsided, leaving only the weary ache of her long journey. His mark began to glow, faintly at first, but it has grown stronger with every moon. The magic in him is waking, Ilarion. It calls to the magic of this land, to his birthright. I could not keep him hidden any longer. He was getting sick, wasting away in the woods. He needs to be here. Whatever the risk, he needs to be anchored to his power. Ilarion stared at her, the pieces clicking into place behind his eyes. The glowing mark, the waking magic. It explained the tremors the seers had been feeling, the instability in the wards along the borderlands. It all led back to this child, his son. He walked over to the hearth and looked down at Liam. For the first time, the cold mask of the king was completely gone, replaced by a look of profound, agonizing conflict. He saw the curve of his own jaw in the boy's sleeping face, the shape of his hands. He saw the heir he had given up on, the piece of himself he thought he had lost forever. Slowly, as if it cost him a great deal of effort, he reached down. His fingers, calloused and scarred from wielding a sword, gently brushed a strand of hair from the boy's cheek. Liam stirred but didn't wake, instinctively leaning into the touch. A shudder went through Ilarion's massive frame. It was the touch of a father, hesitant and full of a pain so deep it was terrifying to behold. He straightened up abruptly, turning away from the boy as if the sight was too much to bear. He paced to the far window, staring out at the moonlit courtyard below. "You have brought me an heir at the edge of an abyss," he said, his back to her. "The northern packs are restless. The frost giants stir beyond the wall. The old packs are failing, Seren. The magic that binds this kingdom is fraying. For 5 years, I have ruled a kingdom that is slowly dying, believing my line would die with it." He turned back to face her, and the full crushing weight of his kingship was in his eyes. There was no anger now, only a terrifying, bleak clarity. The seers spoke of a prophesied heir, one whose birth would signal either the renewal of our age or its final bloody end. They said this heir would be the key. He looked from her to their sleeping son. "You did not just bring my son home, Serena. You have brought me the weapon that will either save us or be the instrument of our destruction." He took a step towards her, his voice dropping to a deadly, intimate whisper. "And you, his mother, the ghost I sent away, are now the very heart of this war. Welcome back to your cage." Serena woke to a world of suffocating softness. For 5 years, her bed had been a mat of pine boughs and packed earth, her blanket the pelt of a deer she had hunted herself. Now she was adrift in a sea of down and silk, the air thick with the ghost of a life she no longer recognized. Sunlight, muted by heavy velvet curtains, painted dusty stripes across the room. Beside her, Liam slept on, his small body curled into a perfect ball, one hand clutching the fur blanket. He was the only real thing in this room of phantoms. Her body ached with a tension that sleep had not eased. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to take her son and disappear back into the anonymity of the deep woods. But Ilarion's final words from the night before were a chain, binding her here as surely as the armed guards outside her door. "Welcome back to your cage. A cage of golden memory, the cruelest prison of all." A soft knock came at the door, followed by the sound of the bar being lifted. 2 servants entered, their heads bowed, faces carefully blank. One carried a tray laden with steaming porridge, fresh bread, and honey. The other held a folded pile of clothing. They moved with a silent, practiced efficiency, placing the tray on the table and the clothes on a wooden chest. They did not speak. They did not meet her eyes. They were ghosts of a different sort, instructed to serve her needs but offer no comfort, no information, no humanity. When they were done, they bowed again and left, the bar sliding back into place with a definitive thud. The clothes were made of fine wool and soft linen, dyed the deep blue of a twilight sky. A child's tunic and breeches in the same rich color lay on top. It was a uniform for a highborn lady and her son, a costume for the roles they were now forced to play. Stripping off her worn leathers felt like shedding her skin, peeling away the hardened survivor she had become to reveal the vulnerable woman beneath. The soft wool felt alien against her skin, a mockery of her freedom. "Are we staying here, Mama?" Liam asked. now awake and watching her with his unnervingly perceptive silver eyes. "For a little while," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. She helped him dress, her fingers lingering on the mark on his shoulder, hidden now beneath the fine cloth. It felt warm to the touch, a low thrum of energy emanating from it that had not been there before. The castle was feeding him, anchoring him, just as she had hoped, and just as she had feared. They ate in silence, the quiet of the room a stark contrast to the familiar morning sounds of the forest, the chatter of birds, the rustle of leaves. Here, the only sound was the distant, muffled clang of steel on steel from the training yard below. The sound of warriors, the sound of the cage's bars. Later, as Liam amused himself by stalking dust motes in the sunbeams, another visitor was announced by the scraping of the bar. Serene's back stiffened. She expected Ilarion, braced for another confrontation, but it was Lady Alara who swept into the room, her crimson gown a slash of color against the chamber's muted tones. She was flanked by two of her own ladies-in-waiting, who remained hovering by the door like well-dressed vultures. "My dear Serene," Alara purred, her smile as sharp and thin as a shard of glass. "The king has granted me leave to check on your comfort. It must be so overwhelming for you, returning to civilization after so long." Her eyes raked over Serene's simple wool dress, then lingered on Liam. "And the boy, he has a wild look about him. It's to be expected, I suppose. Raised in a den like some stray." Serene moved to stand between Alara and her son. "He is the Alpha King's heir, Alara. You would do well to remember that." Alara's laugh was a tinkling, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I do not doubt his resemblance. It is a remarkable trick of the light. But an heir must be more than just a face. He must have breeding, strength, and undisputed lineage." Her gaze was pure poison. "Tell me, Serene, were the winters very lonely out there? A woman has needs. Who is to say what comfort you might have sought in the arms of some woodsman or passing rogue?" Serene's wolf, weak as it was, snarled in her mind. A primal rage, hot and pure, surged through her, her hand clenched into a fist at her side. "Get out." "I am only voicing the questions the entire court is asking," Alara said, taking a step closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They remember the healer's verdict, barren, an empty vessel, and then you appear, years later, with a child of the right age and the right eyes. It is all a little too convenient, a little too desperate." Liam, sensing his mother's distress, moved to her side and glared at Alara, letting out a low, guttural growl that was shockingly deep. Alara recoiled, her mask of civility slipping to reveal a flash of genuine fear. The boy's scent was not that of a common child. It was laced with the ozone of raw, untamed alpha power. "You will not speak to my mother that way," Liam said, his voice small but vibrating with an authority that was a perfect echo of his father's. Before Alara could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted. The guards at the door snapped to attention. Ilarion stood in the doorway, his presence sucking all the air and warmth from the chamber. He had not come from the hall. He had come from the adjoining private study, a door Serene had forgotten existed. He had heard everything. His silver eyes were chips of lethal ice. They were not fixed on Serene or his son, but were locked on Lady Alara with a look of such cold, murderous fury that she physically paled. "Lady Alara," he said, his voice deceptively soft, "you have forgotten yourself. You are in the presence of the mother of the heir apparent." He took a slow, deliberate step into the room. "You question her honor. Therefore you question my son's legitimacy. Therefore you question me." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This is treason." Fear, stark and absolute, flooded Alara's scent. She dropped into a deep, trembling curtsy. "Your Majesty, I meant no disrespect. I was merely concerned." "Your concern is no longer required," Ilarion stated, his voice flat and final. He gestured to the door. "Leave. And know that if you ever approach either of them again without my express permission, the consequences will be far more permanent than a simple dismissal." Alara scrambled to her feet and fled, her ladies-in-waiting scurrying after her like frightened mice. The door closed, and the bar slammed home, leaving the three of them in a tense, ringing silence. Ilarion's fury did not dissipate. It simply shifted its focus to her. "This is why I kept you locked in here. The court is a nest of vipers, and you walk into it with all the subtlety of a wounded deer. I did not invite her, Seren shot back, her own anger flaring. Am I to be a prisoner and a scapegoat? You are to be protected, he roared, the sound vibrating through the stone floor. Liam flinched, and Ilarian's anger immediately banked, his expression tightening with self-reproach. He closed his eyes for a moment, wrestling for control. When he opened them again, the king was gone, replaced by a man burdened by an impossible weight. He looked at Liam, who was still glaring at him with defiant eyes. Ilarion's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. He held out his hand. In it was a small, exquisitely carved wooden wolf, its fur detailed with tiny, intricate knife strokes, its head thrown back in a silent howl. It was old, the wood worn smooth with time. My father gave this to me when I was your age, Ilarion said, his voice low and directed only at the boy. He said a king must never forget the beast that runs within him. Liam looked from the wolf to his mother, seeking permission. Seren gave a slight nod. Hesitantly, Liam stepped forward and took the toy. His small fingers traced the carved wood, a look of wonder on his face. He looked up at Ilarion, a flicker of something other than fear in his eyes. Ilarion watched him, and Seren saw the profound loneliness in the king's face, the chasm of 5 lost years. He looked at her then, and for a heartbeat, the space between them was filled not with anger, but with a shared, aching grief for everything they had lost. The memory of a younger Ilarion carving a small bird for her by the fire in this very room rose unbidden in her mind. He needs a father, Ilarion, she said softly. Not just a king. He has a king, Ilarion replied, his voice harsh as he pulled his walls back up. That is all I can afford to be. He started to turn away, his duty calling him back to the world beyond these doors, but he stopped, his head tilting as he caught a scent in the air, the faint cloying trace of Alara's perfume clinging to the wool of Seren's sleeve where the woman had gotten too close. His wolf, always simmering just beneath the surface, surged forward. In 2 strides he was before her, his powerful presence overwhelming. Before she could react, he seized her arm, his grip firm but not bruising. He lowered his head, his face burying in the curve of her neck, and inhaled deeply. It was a shockingly intimate, proprietary gesture. His own scent, winter, pine, and pure alpha, erupted around her, a possessive, overwhelming wave that scrubbed away Alara's lingering perfume and branded her with his own. Seren froze, her breath catching in her throat. His breath was hot against her skin, the rough stubble of his jaw scraping her sensitive flesh. Her own traitorous wolf, starved for the touch of its alpha, let out a silent, pathetic purr. Every nerve ending came alive, a jolt of primal connection arcing between them, so powerful it made her dizzy. It was the bond, frayed and damaged but not broken, roaring back to life. He lifted his head, his silver eyes blazing, no longer cold, but molten with a raw, possessive fire. He was looking at her as if he was seeing her for the first time in 5 years, not as a ghost or a problem, but as his. Let the vipers whisper, he growled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration against her skin. Let them see you, but know this, Seren. His thumb brushed over her pulse point, where her heart hammered like a trapped bird. You are mine, your scent, your son, your life. It all belongs to me. You are mine to protect, and mine to punish. Do not forget it again. The echo of his possessive growl lingered in the air long after he was gone. Seren stood frozen, her hand pressed to her neck, where the heat of his breath and the ghost of his touch still burned. Her skin tingled, branded by a scent that was both a threat and a homecoming. Her wolf, a creature she had thought beaten into submission, was a riot of confused instincts. It preened at the alpha's claim, a deep, cellular satisfaction warring with the fierce, protective fury of the mother whose pup had been threatened. He had wrapped her in his scent, a warning to the pack, but it felt less like a shield and more like the bars of her cage snapping shut. She was marked. She was his. The 5 years of feral independence she had clawed for herself had been erased in a single primal gesture. Liam watched her, his expression solemn. He held the small wooden wolf in his hand, turning it over and over. He had felt the shift in the room, the raw power that had flared between his parents. He had smelled the claim. Is he our alpha now? Liam asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question was a simple one, but it held the weight of their entire world. He is the king, Seren replied, the words tasting like ash. It was a truth and an evasion. She could not bring herself to explain the complexities of mates and bonds and exile to a 5-year-old. How could she explain that the man who looked at her with such fury was the other half of her soul, a half she had learned to live without? The rest of the day passed in a suspended quiet. More food was brought. A chest of toys and books appeared, all of them finely made, all of them feeling like gilded bribes. Seren tried to read to Liam, but the words of old legends felt hollow when they were living one of their own. She felt Alarian's presence even in his absence. His scent clung to her, a constant, invasive reminder. She paced the length of the chambers, from the window overlooking the training yard to the tapestry depicting a long-dead queen, feeling like the she-wolf in the story, caught in a hunter's trap. Late in the afternoon, the stone guard with the gray beard returned. "The Alpha King summons you and the boy," he said, his voice a respectful rumble. "The Elder Council has convened." Ice trickled down Seren's spine. The Elders. The same council that had listened to the healer's reports, nodded grimly at their pronouncements of her barrenness, and sanctioned her exile. They were the keepers of the law, the guardians of the pack's traditions. They were the ones who had publicly stripped her of her dignity. Facing them again would be like reopening a wound and pouring salt in it. She took Liam's hand, his small fingers a warm anchor. "We are ready," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. They were not led toward the great hall or the throne room, but down a winding stone staircase into the very heart of the mountain upon which Weilheim was built. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of damp earth, ancient stone, and something else. A low, thrumming energy that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. They arrived at a circular chamber hewn from the living rock. There were no windows. The only light came from a great crackling fire pit in the center of the room. Seated on stone thrones carved into the wall were the 5 elders, their faces grim and shadowed in the firelight. Lord Boren was there, his bulk spilling over the sides of his seat, and next to him sat a stern, hawk-faced woman, Matron Griselda, whose pronouncements on bloodlines and purity were law. Alarian stood before the fire, his back to them as they entered. He was dressed not in the finery of a king, but in black leather breeches and a simple tunic, the attire of a warrior. He radiated a dangerous energy, a barely contained violence that seemed to feed the flames, making them leap and dance. He was not a king here, not entirely. He was the Alpha, meeting with the ancient power of his pack. He turned as they entered, his silver eyes finding hers. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a grim warning. "Follow my lead." "You have seen the boy," Alarian's voice echoed in the stone chamber. "You have seen the mark he bears. The prophecy is fulfilled. The heir has come." Matron Griselda rose slowly, her joints creaking like old wood, her eyes, small and black as chips of obsidian, fixed on Seren. "We see a child who bears a resemblance, Alpha King. We see a mark that can be forged by witchcraft. What we remember is a Luna we ourselves declared barren, a vessel incapable of carrying the Velric line. The law is clear. A child's legitimacy is drawn from the purity of its mother." Her words were a direct challenge, an accusation of adultery and deceit. Seren felt a hot flush of rage. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend her honor, but Alarion's hand shot out, a silent command for her to remain still. "Your memory is selective, matron," Alarian said, his voice dangerously calm. "You remember the healer's verdict, but you forget the oldest of laws. Blood does not lie. The magic of our line does not lie." "Magic can be twisted," Lord Boren grumbled, stroking his stained beard. 5 years in the wild. Who knows what dark art she may have consorted with to produce such a deception. The fire in the center of the room sputtered, the flames shrinking for a moment as if in response to the poisoned air. Liam, who had been standing silently by Seren's side, took a step forward. His small body was rigid, his hands clenched into fists. He was watching the elders, his silver eyes glowing with a faint inner light in the dim chamber. He felt the threat to his mother, the challenge to his own existence. "He is Maya," Seren said, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. unable to remain silent any longer. "He is your king's son." "Prove it," Matron Griselda snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "Show us a sign that is more than mere appearance." A low growl rumbled in Liam's chest. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with ozone, like the air before a lightning strike. The fire in the pit roared to life, the flames surging 10 feet into the air with a sound like a great beast's exhalation. The colors shifted from orange and yellow to a brilliant, unearthly silver, the same color as the eyes of the king and his son. The stones of the chamber hummed with power, and the elders shrank back in their thrones, their faces etched with shock and fear. Liam stood at the heart of it all, his small form silhouetted against the silver inferno. The crescent moon mark on his shoulder burned with such intensity that it was visible even through the thick wool of his tunic. This was not a child's tantrum. This was a raw, untamed force of nature, the ancient magic of the Vaelric bloodline made manifest. As quickly as it had come, the power receded. The silver flames shrank back to a normal, crackling fire. The humming in the stones ceased. Liam swayed on his feet, his face pale, the effort draining him. Seren rushed forward and caught him, pulling him back against her. Silence. The elders stared, their skepticism incinerated by the raw display of power. Alarion had not moved, but his face was a mask of awe, pride, and a chilling understanding. He had known the boy was powerful, but he had not understood the sheer, elemental scale of it. He looked at Seren, his eyes communicating 1,000 things. "This is what you were hiding. This is the weapon I spoke of." "Does any other elder," Alarion said, his voice a soft, deadly purr that cut through the stunned silence, "wish to question the legitimacy of my heir?" No one spoke. Matron Griselda sank back into her stone throne, her face ashen. Lord Boren seemed to have shrunk, his gaze fixed on the fire, as if he expected it to erupt again. "Good," Alarion said. He gave a sharp nod to the guard. "Take them back to the West Wing." As Seren guided a weary Liam from the chamber, she felt Alarion's eyes on her back. She had won the confrontation, but she felt no triumph. She had only proven that her son was exactly what Alarion feared he was, a power too great to be controlled, a key that could unlock salvation or ruin. Later that night, long after Liam had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Alarion came to her again. He didn't enter from the hall, but through the private study as before. He carried with him the scent of the cold night air and a bottle of dark northern wine. He poured 2 goblets without a word and handed one to her. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a jolt through her, a current of shared energy that was both familiar and frightening. They stood by the tall arched window, looking out over the moon-drenched landscape. The snow-capped peaks of the distant mountains gleamed like silver fangs against the black sky. "What he did in the chamber," Alarion began, his voice rough. "I have never seen anything like it. Not even my father could command the ancestral flame like that." "He was protecting me," Seren said softly. His instincts took over. "Instincts that could burn this castle to the ground," he countered, though there was no heat in his words, only a weary gravity. He took a long swallow of wine, his gaze fixed on the mountains. She noticed the way his left hand unconsciously went to the scar on his temple. It was a faint line, pale against his skin in the moonlight, but she knew it had nearly killed him. "You got that scar after I left," she stated quietly. It was not a question. He looked at her, surprised by her perception. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "The winter after I sent you away. A scouting party on the northern border. We were ambushed, not by men." He paused, and a shadow passed through his eyes, a memory of true horror. It was a creature of ice and shadow, something out of the old dark legends. It bled cold instead of blood. It took 10 of my best warriors to bring it down. I earned this, he touched the scar, for my trouble. The frost giants are stirring, Seren. They are testing the borders. The old wards, the ones powered by my bloodline, are weakening. My blood is not enough anymore. It requires new life, a new source. He turned to face her fully, his expression stripped of all pretense. In the moonlight, he was not just the king, but the man she remembered, his face etched with the terrible burden of his crown. The prophecy says the heir's magic will restore the wards and drive back the long winter, but it also says that if his power is not properly anchored and controlled by the time the blood moon rises, It will shatter the wards completely, leaving us defenseless. When is the blood moon? She asked, her heart growing cold. The next solstice, he answered, his voice grim. We have less than 3 months. He was so close now. She could see the flecks of gray in his black hair, the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes. He reached out, his fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently touched her cheek. His touch was not possessive now, but achingly tender, full of 5 years of unspoken regret. I was a fool, he whispered, the words a confession torn from his soul. I let my pride and my grief blind me. I pushed you away when I needed you most. That winter, after the attack, I called for you in my fever dreams. Her breath hitched. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. He caught it with his thumb, his silver eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. The bond between them hummed, a low, sorrowful song of what might have been. He leaned in, his lips just a breath from hers, and for a moment the king was gone, the exile was gone, and there were only 2 mates, drawn together by a fate they couldn't escape. The moment shattered. The great doors to the chamber were thrown open with a crash. The gray-bearded stone guard stood there, his face grim, his breathing ragged. Your Majesty, he gasped, foregoing all protocol. An urgent message from the northern pass, the watchtower at Dragon's Tooth. It's gone silent. The intimacy of the moment shattered like glass, the pieces scattering into the cold, hard reality of the guard's words. Gone silent. 3 words that meant ice and blood and death. Ilarion pulled back from her as if burned, the tender vulnerability in his eyes instantly replaced by the glacial focus of the Alpha King. The walls were back up, thicker and higher than before. The brief truce between them was over, obliterated by the encroaching winter. How long? Ilarion's voice was a blade of sharpened steel. The last raven arrived at dusk, the guard Jorn reported. The moon was not yet risen. They reported unusual atmospheric phenomena, shimmering lights in the sky, a wind that carried the scent of deep ice. Nothing since. Ilarion was already moving, striding toward the door, his mind a whirlwind of strategy and battle plans. He was the warrior king again, the wolf scenting a threat on his borders. He paused at the doorway and looked back, not at Seren, but at the small, still form of Liam sleeping by the fire. The weight of his new reality seemed to crash down on him again. He now had more to lose than just a kingdom. Double the guard on these chambers, he commanded Jorn, his voice a low growl. No one enters, no one. His eyes finally met Seren's across the room. And the message in them was clear. Stay here, stay safe. Keep him safe. It was a command, not a request. Then he was gone, his heavy, purposeful footsteps echoing down the stone corridor, swallowed by the vast, silent castle. The doors were closed, the bar thudded back into place, and Seren was alone again in her gilded cage, the scent of wine and his near confession still hanging in the air. The warmth of his touch on her cheek faded, replaced by a chilling dread. Dragon's Tooth was the northernmost outpost, the first line of defense against the horrors that bred in the frozen wastes. If it had fallen, the enemy was closer than anyone knew. For 2 days, she was a true prisoner. Food was brought, fires were tended, but the guards were silent monoliths, offering no news. The atmosphere in the castle had changed. The distant sounds of the training yard were more frantic now, the clang of steel ringing from dawn until well after dusk. The air itself felt thin, stretched taut with fear and anticipation. Through her window, Seren saw riders leaving in haste, their cloaks flapping like ravens' wings against the snow-dusted ground. Ilarion was preparing for war. Liam felt the shift too. He was quiet and withdrawn. The wooden wolf clutched constantly in his hand. The raw magic that had erupted in the Elder's chamber now lay dormant, but it hummed just beneath his skin, restless and agitated, mirroring the tension in the castle. He would stare out the window for hours, his silver eyes fixed on the northern peaks, as if he could see the encroaching threat. On the 3rd night, Seren could bear it no longer. The passivity, the not knowing, was a poison. Her wolf, weak as it was, paced the confines of her mind, snarling at her inaction. Her pup was in danger, the entire pack was in danger, and she was locked away like a fragile trinket. Liam was asleep, his face troubled even in his dreams. Seren stood before the great redwood doors, listening. She could hear the slow, rhythmic breathing of the 2 guards stationed outside. She placed her hand on the cold wood, focusing. In her 5 years of exile, she had not only learned to survive, she had relearned herself. Away from the stifling politics of the court and the oppressive weight of her failure, she had reconnected with the deeper, quieter magic of the earth. She could listen to the wind, read the stories in the trees, and feel the hum of life in the stone. She closed her eyes, extending her senses, pushing them past the wood of the door, into the stone of the walls. She felt the vibrations of the castle, the distant heartbeat of the great forge in the armory, the nervous energy of the pack. She focused on the bar locking the door, a heavy piece of iron resting in 2 thick brackets. It was a simple physical obstacle. She reached for the faint thrumming energy she had felt in the elder's chamber, the magic that was her son's birthright, and by extension, a whisper of her own. She found a thin silver thread of it inside herself, a connection to the Veilric line forged by her bond with Ilarion. She pulled on it, not with force, but with quiet intent. She pictured the iron bar lifting, rising silently from its brackets. Sweat beaded on her forehead. The muscles in her arm trembled with the strain. It was like trying to lift a mountain with a single thread. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she heard it, a faint metallic scrape. The bar lifted a fraction of an inch. She pushed harder, her breath held tight in her chest. With a final, silent groan of protesting metal, the bar cleared the brackets and swung free. The door was unlocked. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She slipped out into the darkened corridor, a ghost in her own home. The 2 guards stood with their backs to her, their attention focused down the hall. Moving with the silence she had learned in the forest, she melted into the shadows of a stone archway, her heart in her throat. Her goal was the War Council chamber. She needed to know what was happening. She navigated the castle by memory and instinct, a shadow flitting through pools of moonlight. The halls were mostly deserted, the life of the castle drawn to the armory and the great hall. Finally, she reached the council chamber doors. They were thick oak, but a sliver of light escaped from beneath them, and the low, urgent murmur of voices carried through. She pressed her ear to the cold wood, her senses straining. "No survivors!" Ilarion's voice was ragged, stripped of all artifice, heavy with grief and fury. "We found the tower. It was encased, frozen solid in a glacier of black ice. The men were still at their posts, statues of frost. Whatever did this, it wasn't a raiding party. It was magic. Old, dark magic." A tremor of fear went through Seren. She pictured the men she knew, their faces frozen in their final moments of terror. "The seers are calling it the Ice Sheath," another voice said, one she recognized as General Vorlog, a hard, pragmatic wolf. "An ancient spell of the frost giants. It requires a massive sacrifice of life force to power it. They must have slaughtered a dozen mammoths on the peak to fuel a spell of that magnitude. Or they found a new power source," Ilarion countered, his voice grim. Seren could almost see him, leaning over a map, his face a mask of exhaustion and grim determination. "The scouts report that the ice is spreading. Slowly but steadily, it is creeping down from the pass. In a week, it will reach the forest. In 2, the outer villages." "We cannot fight a glacier, Your Majesty," Vorlog stated. "No," Ilarion agreed, "but we can fight the ones who cast it. Their magic has a source, a focal point. We must find it and destroy it. I will lead a company north at dawn. We will cut the head from the snake." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Seren. Ilarion was going north. He was going to face this dark magic himself, the same magic that had nearly killed him 5 years ago. And what would happen to Liam, to the kingdom, if he didn't return? The thought was unbearable. "Your Majesty, that is too great a risk," Vorlog protested. "The kingdom needs you here, your heir." "My heir is the very reason I must go." Ilarion's roar was that of a cornered wolf. "The wards are failing because my blood is not enough. His is not yet ready. If I do not stop this now, there will be no kingdom for him to inherit." "This is not a debate, General. Prepare the men." Seren stumbled back from the door, her mind reeling. He was going to his death. She could feel it with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow. She had to do something. She could not stand by and let him sacrifice himself. She fled back through the silent corridors, her plan forming in the desperate crucible of her fear. She reached her chambers, slipped inside, and barred the door, this time from the inside. Her hands were shaking. She went to her sleeping son, his innocent face a stark contrast to the horrors being discussed in the council room. She knelt beside him, brushing the hair from his forehead. The skin over his birthmark was warm, humming with a gentle sleeping power. "I need your help, little wolf," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I need a little of your strength." She placed her palm flat against his mark. She didn't try to take his power, but to connect with it. She opened herself to the silver thread of the Valric magic within her, the thread of her bond to Ilarion, and used it as a bridge to Liam's deep, untapped well. A gentle warmth flowed into her, not a torrent, but a steady, strengthening stream. It didn't feel foreign. It felt like a missing piece of herself returning. It filled the empty, hollow spaces inside her, strengthening the dormant spirit of her own wolf. For the first time in 5 years, she felt its presence not as a whimper, but as a steady, rising growl. She felt whole. She stood, the new energy thrumming through her veins. She went to the chest at the foot of her bed and threw it open. Beneath the fine wool and linen gowns the servants had brought, at the very bottom, was the bundle she had arrived with. She pulled out her old leathers. They were worn and patched, smelling of wood smoke and the wild, but they fit her like a second skin. As she dressed, she felt as if she were putting on her armor, reclaiming the woman she had been forced to become. She then went to Ilarion's private study. The room was a reflection of him, Spartan, organized, filled with maps and scrolls. On a stand in the corner rested a sheathed sword. It was not his great sword, the one he carried into battle, but a lighter, faster blade, perfectly balanced. A Luna's blade, her blade. He had kept it all these years, her fingers wrapped around the familiar leather grip, the weapon a natural extension of her arm. She looked at her reflection in the polished surface of a silver shield hanging on the wall. The woman looking back was no longer the broken, exiled Luna. Her eyes, filled with the faint silver light borrowed from her son, held a fierce, unwavering resolve. She was a mother, she was a wolf, and she would not let her alpha, the father of her pup, walk into the dark alone. She waited by the window, watching the moon trace its arc across the sky. Just before the first hint of dawn, she heard the sounds of the war party assembling in the main courtyard. She took one last look at Liam, sleeping peacefully, and whispered, "Be safe." She unlatched the heavy window, the cold air rushing in to greet her. The drop to the stone walkway below was 2 stories. A fall that would cripple a normal person, but she was not normal. She was filled with a strength that was not entirely her own. She swung her legs over the sill, found a foothold in the ornate stonework, and began to climb down, as sure-footed as the wolves she had run with in the wild. She landed silently on the flagstones below, melting into the pre-dawn shadows. She could smell them before she saw them. 50 of the kingdom's finest warriors, the scent of their leather, steel, and nervous anticipation thick in the air. At their head, astride a massive black warhorse, was Ilarion. He was clad in black plate armor, his great sword strapped to his back, his face grim under the shadow of his helmet. He looked like a god of war, magnificent and terrible. And he was riding to his doom. Seren moved through the shadows at the edge of the courtyard, her borrowed sword strapped to her own back. She found a riderless horse tied near the gate, a spare for the quartermaster. As Ilarion gave the final command and the gates began to grind open, she swung herself into the saddle. She pulled her hood low over her face and nudged the horse into the rear of the column as they trotted out into the gray, misty dawn. The king was riding north to face the winter. He did not know that the ghost of his past, armed with the magic of his future, was riding with him. The first true spring in 6 years had come to Valheim. It was a tentative thing at first, a whisper of green in the valleys and the scent of thawing earth on the wind, but it had grown with a fierce, undeniable strength. Now, from the balcony of the West Wing, Seren could see a kingdom reborn. The fields were lush, the great river ran clear and free of ice, and the sound of children's laughter drifted up from the village below the castle walls, a sound that had been absent for far too long. A year had passed since the ride north, a year since the battle in the heart of the blizzard at the foot of the black glacier that had threatened to swallow the world. The memory was not a nightmare, but a scar, and like all scars, it was a testament to survival. She could still feel the biting cold, see the shadowy form of the frost giant shaman who had been the source of the insidious magic. She remembered the terror, the desperation, and the blinding, searing moment when it had all turned. Alarion, fighting with the fury of a king defending his very soul, had been faltering. The creature's magic was a thing of absolute cold, draining life and warmth, and his strength was not enough. Seren, fighting at his side, felt his life force waning. In that moment of utter despair, she had reached not for her sword, but for the two bonds that defined her. She had opened herself to the silver thread connecting her to Liam, miles away in the castle, and pulled. She did not take his power, but borrowed it, becoming a conduit. The raw, untamed magic of the air surged through her, a torrent of silver fire. Then she reached for the other bond, the one frayed and scarred by 5 years of pain and exile, and pushed all of that borrowed power into Alarion. For a heartbeat, the three of them had been one, a circuit of blood and silver, of ancient power and new life, connected by a bond that could not be broken. Alarion had roared, and it was not just his own voice, but the echo of his son's power. He had risen, his armor glowing with an inner light, and the great sword in his hands had burned with a silver flame that melted the black ice and turned the encroaching winter to steam. When he struck the final blow, the shaman had not just died, it had been unmade, its dark magic annihilated by the combined might of the Veilric line. The glacier had shattered with a sound like the cracking of the world, and when the sun had risen, its light had touched the northern peaks for the first time in a generation. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her back against a solid, familiar chest. Alarion's scent, winter pine, iron, and a warmth that was now reserved only for her, enveloped her. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his gaze following hers out over the peaceful kingdom. "It's a good sight," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. The hard edges of the king were gone, softened by a year of peace, a year of rediscovering the man he was. "It is," she agreed, leaning back into his embrace. Her hand came up to cover his, her fingers lacing through his. The scars on his hands were a familiar map to her now, just as the lines of hardship on her own face were a history he had learned to read with a gentle reverence. They were not the same two people who had faced each other in the Great Hall. The prideful king and the broken exile were gone. In their place stood a man and a woman who had walked through the fire together and had been forged into something stronger. The elders now bowed to her, not as the returned Luna, but as the Silver Queen, the warrior who had helped save them all. The whispers of the court had been replaced by a deep, abiding respect. "Mama, Papa!" A small whirlwind of black hair and silver eyes burst onto the balcony. Liam, now 6 years old, was no longer the quiet, solemn child of the forest. He was vibrant, his laughter a constant echo in the halls that had once been too silent. He held up his hand, his small face screwed up in concentration. A tiny, perfect ice crystal, shimmering with all the colors of the spring sun, formed in his palm. He grinned, a perfect mirror of his father's rare, true smile. "I did it," he proclaimed. Alarion chuckled, releasing Seren to crouch down before their son. "You did, little wolf. Your control is getting stronger." He took Liam's hand, and with a gentle breath of warmth, the crystal melted into a single perfect drop of water. Power is not just about making things, but unmaking them too. It is about balance. Liam nodded, his expression serious, as he absorbed the lesson. He looked between his parents, his silver eyes shining with an uncomplicated love that was the foundation of their new world. "Are you coming to the training yard? General Vorlug said he would show me the proper way to hold a shield today." "We will be down in a moment," Serene promised, ruffling his hair. He beamed and with another burst of energy, raced back inside. Alarion stood, his eyes following his son until he was gone. When he looked back at Seren, his expression was one of profound, quiet gratitude. "He is the best of us," he said softly. "He is the best of us," she corrected, stepping into his space, her hands resting on his chest. "He is our bond, made real." He placed a hand over hers, his thumb stroking her knuckles. The simple, possessive gesture that had once felt like a brand now felt like an anchor. "I almost lost it all," he whispered, the confession still raw after all this time. "My kingdom, my son, my mate." "But you didn't," she said, her voice firm. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was not one of desperate passion or rediscovered hunger, but of deep, quiet certainty. It spoke of shared memories, of forgiveness, and of a future they were building together, stone by stone. It was the kiss of a king and his queen, a wolf and his mate, bound together not by prophecy, but by choice. He pulled back, resting his forehead against hers. "No, Juan," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "We did not." They stood together on the balcony, the warmth of the sun on their faces. Below, their son's laughter rang out from the training yard, a promise of the future. The Baron Luna and the Cold King were ghosts of another time, another story. Here, now, stood a family, whole and unbroken, their scars a reminder not of what they had lost, but of everything they had fought to reclaim. The bond had not died. It had waited, it had been tested, and it had risen to forge a crown, a kingdom, and a love that would shelter their people for generations to come. Their reign had just begun.